And where we left off last time was here. And I left you with the example of how jealousy is appropriate in a marriage covenant. And not only appropriate, but to be expected. You know, if the spouse is cheating, well, it is just simply not right for that to be okay with the spouse that's getting cheated on. It's just, that'd be weird. Okay. So not only is it appropriate, but it's also necessary and fitting. Now, why was Yahweh so angry? Well, he was angry because the Israelites kept doing the same stupid thing. And, you know, we sometimes read the Old Testament and we think, gosh, how could they be such idiots? And what's so great about a golden calf anyway? I mean, didn't that ever occur to you? Of all the things you guys could have thought of doing, why a golden calf? I mean, it just seems, but see, we don't understand the mindset. We don't understand the mindset. Mr. Johnson?
Like, I understand how a human can be jealous, but I feel like jealousy is like a sign of some sort of imperfection.
How would it be a sign of imperfection? Now, that's a really good question. I want to clarify something before we finish answering it. Jealousy can definitely be a sign of an imperfection in other areas, and I'll give you some. Oh, I'm jealous of so-and-so because he runs so fast and I don't. I'm jealous of, you know, Susie Q because she's so pretty and I'm less, right? These are these are imperfections, right? And these are borderline contrary to the 10th commandment. Okay. So Levi brought up a good point, because jealousy can certainly be an imperfection or worse. But jealousy in this context is different, okay? This isn't the jealousy in the context of, I want what that person has and I'm angry that I don't have it. This is jealousy in the context that in a relationship, right, you don't want, it's a negative desire. You don't want infidelity. You see how that's a different kind of jealousy? It's not the same kind of jealousy. But you're right. If it were the other kind, that would be an imperfection. Okay. This really indicates a perfection of love. And that perfection of love expresses itself in the negative desire, which is against that person's infidelity. Conversely, it reflects a positive desire for that person's fidelity. Does that clarification make some sense?
Yeah.
Kind of. Kind of isn't good enough.
Okay. I feel like God shouldn't and can't be jealous because he's like.
Are we talking now? Clarify. Are you talking about this kind of jealousy? Not the other kind? Okay. Continue.
I don't know. I feel like maybe I just don't have the right definition of jealousy, but I feel like for God it would be something like, it would be a slightly like different thing.
Well, here's another way to approach the problem. When we talk about God the Father and God the Holy Spirit, we use the words anger, jealousy, want, hurts, offends. But in reality, God, those two persons, who are completely outside of time and completely spiritual, don't have emotions, don't change, don't want. You see what I'm saying? This is our human way of understanding the infinite God that we can't fully understand. Okay, now that doesn't only apply to jealousy, it also applies to anger and desire and many other things that we attribute to God the Father and God the Holy Spirit. However, and this is really important, the second person of the Trinity became human, which means the second person of the Trinity, as God, suffers nothing, wants nothing, changes nothing, but as man, suffers, is offended, wants, is jealous. You see what I'm saying? And that's an important distinction to make as well. Mr. Trent.
Well, I think that the jealousy is more a sign of justice than anything.
Yeah, that's a good take. Why don't you explain your position a little bit more, Johnny?
So it's sort of like they entered into this covenant. There's sort of a contractual agreement, and when they break that, then justice has to be enacted.
It's good. Okay, so now what Johnny's saying is kind of taking our focus away from this emotional aspect and looking at it more as justice because it is a contract, right? And it is a contract which must be followed. If not, there are consequences. That's a perfectly good way to look at it as well. Okay, let's go on to the next major issue, which sometimes causes confusion. The demand for human sacrifice. Now, Yahweh didn't do this except one time, and that was Isaac. Yahweh demands the sacrifice of Isaac, which seems immoral and illogical. It also seems cruel. Why would Yahweh want him to kill his son? First of all, killing's bad. Second, isn't that the son of the promise through whom he would bless many generations? Yes. And so it seems immoral and cruel, and it also seems to just not make sense. But we need to understand it properly. Okay, to order someone to do something as a test when you have no intention of that thing being carried out is very different. And the order to sacrifice Isaac was a test. It was a test of Abraham's fidelity. Now, did God, as God, right, and an immaterial being who's outside of time, did he need to test Abraham? Because didn't he know? Well, God didn't need to test it, but Abraham needed to be tested in order to grow in his own fidelity. See, when we do something, it changes us. When you do bad and you make a bad choice, it changes you for ill. When you do good, you make a good choice, it changes you for good. And so Abraham is the one who needed to be tested. And in proving his fidelity to himself and to God, he then gained the eternal blessing of God. This was the pivotal moment in Abraham's life, a moment that defined him forever. Okay? But notice that is different, and that's a very positive thing. Yahweh had no intention of murdering Isaac. And not only that, we sometimes forget about Ishmael, and we sometimes think, oh yeah, that was a mistake. All right, yeah, it was, I guess, a mistake, right? Shouldn't have done it. But he still loved Ishmael a great deal. Ishmael was Abraham's firstborn. Abraham's firstborn was not Isaac. Isaac was his secondborn. And so Abraham had already given up his firstborn son. He had already done it. He had already made the great sacrifice. And now Yahweh was asking him to give up his second. What a tremendous thing. But see, here's the beauty of the test, is that Abraham trusted even though it didn't make sense. Abraham trusted even though it didn't make sense. This is the characteristic of a holy person. All right, it's like the test of Job. You know, no one claims that Job was a historical person. And that book wasn't meant to be a historical book, the way it's written and everything, but it teaches an extremely valuable lesson. Job had everything. It all got taken away. And instead of cursing God, he blessed the Lord. It didn't make sense, but he still knew that God was in charge and that God knew what he was doing. This is exactly what Abraham did, folks. And it's such a lesson for us too. Aside from forgiving your enemies, this is probably the most difficult part of Christianity. So we all know forgiving enemies is tough. But just as tough, or right up there, has got to be trusting in God when everything's going wrong. When some terrible thing happens to you or a loved one, when some terrible thing happens in the world, right? Still trusting that God's in charge. That can be very hard. Miss Griffin.
What happened to Ishmael?
Ishmael got sent away, with Hagar. And the tradition, we don't know for sure, but the tradition that people believed really since the first century was that Ishmael ended up being the founder of the Arabian peoples. So a lot of people say that he's the most ancient ancestor of Islam, because that's where they settled. Yeah. Ishmael did not die though. All right. The test of Abraham is another aspect. The test of Abraham is also a foreshadowing of God's sacrifice of his only son. remember that in the Old Testament, we have things that symbolize or foreshadow what's going to come, right?
I was told to bring a chair. Am I okay
You
using
can
it?
use this one.
Okay.
And if you're more comfortable, you can go forward behind you.
Okay.
So, quick little note about foreshadowing. Sometimes people will say, "Oh yeah, so if the old foreshadows the new, then the old is entirely symbolic." Nonsense. The old has a lot of literal in it, as we've already seen. I'm not going to repeat all the proofs, but just because something literally happened doesn't mean that it can't also symbolically symbolize or foreshadow something that's going to come. Right? The Exodus or the Passover, a sign of something to come, which is, wholly true to him. The Passover happened, yes, literal, truth, event, historical, but symbolic foreshadowing. Okay, there can be both. And that's what we see here. Yes, the sacrifice, the test happened, but it was a foreshadowing of really the biggest sacrifice ever. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac showed his fidelity to Yahweh. The father's willingness to sacrifice his son shows his fidelity to us. You could say that this test was educational then. It was a defining moment in Abraham's life, and it was supremely educational for us. It also shows us the Father's love. As difficult as it was for Abraham to agree to the sacrifice of Isaac, that's how difficult it was for the father to give up his son. Mr. Solomon.
So why is they? I don't know if this is maybe the right thing I should be asking, but why? Not why, but Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, or going his will, isn't that lesser than God's sacrifice of his son?
Oh yeah.
Like,
What? Finish your question.
like isn't it like because Abraham's human and Isaac's human, and it's of just but like that is just so much more like the sacrifice of Jesus.
Yeah.
So
So to answer your question, Michael, and thanks for asking it. Every analogy is going to fall short. That's just the way analogies work. Analogies can help us, but they're not meant to be. There's not meant to be perfect congruence, because there can't be. Now let's point out a couple differences that one I highlighted is by Michael. Another one I'm going to highlight. So the first difference is that in the case of Abraham, is one human sacrificing another. In the case of God, it's a divine person. So that's quite different. But there's another difference. The other difference is this. Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac would have been a direct killing of his son. Stab, kill. That's what it would have been. But the sacrifice of the father of his only son was not a killing. This is a very important thing for us to understand. The father did not kill the son. The father didn't even directly will the crucifixion to happen. Because if the father had directly willed the crucifixion to happen, that'd be divine child abuse. The father permitted the crucifixion to happen. It's a huge difference. Okay. We talked about the difference before. I'm not going to explain it all again. There's a huge difference between permissive will and direct will. And that's what we have here. All right, next big point in the Old Testament, gradual revelation. Gradual revelation. Yahweh reveals moral truth gradually, which seems to permit actions that we consider immoral today. Things the Israelites were allowed to do that we wouldn't even think of today. And we're going to start with a little bit of historical background. When we study the Old Testament, we simply have to keep in mind the time and place in which it happened. Otherwise, we can't understand it. Now, when I say that they lived during a brutal time, surrounded by brutal neighbors. Well, it's simply a fact. Okay, this was a time when punishments were cruel, right? When infanticide and child sacrifice was common, when there was idolatry of every kind. There were crazy things like, ritual or sacramental prostitution. It was a time of things unimaginable to us today. We need to remember that they were surrounded by all this, okay? They were surrounded by it. Why are we not surrounded by it? Yeah, we live in a pretty hedonistic society, blah, 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 but it's still based on Judeo-Christian values. They didn't have Judeo-Christian values. They had nothing. All they had was might makes right, survival of the fittest, and life is brutal. We've got to remember that. It means they lived in a different time. It also means that they're going to understand God in a different way. The sudden abolition of slavery didn't eradicate racism. We see that in our own country. And the sudden introduction of democracy in North Korea wouldn't eliminate oppression because people can't change that fast. It's just not in their nature to change that fast. In an ideal world, right? End of the Civil War, everything would have been bright and happy and there never would have been segregation. But it happened. Because people just can't change overnight. And that was no less true of the Israelites. Yahweh knew better than to reveal the fullness of truth all at once because the Israelites weren't ready for it. You can't take the truth.
Hey, I know that.
Does anyone know where that's from?
Yeah.
Where's it from, Mr. Solomon?
It's from A Few Good Men.
A Few Good Men. Who said it?
No, it's not Tom Cruise. It's the general, Jack Nicholson.
Jack Nicholson. Classic line. It's a great line. But it applies to what's going on here, right? They couldn't take the truth. It would have shocked them too much and they wouldn't have been able to live it. That's why the law of Moses was temporary, as the New Testament admits. So what are some things the New Testament or the Old Testament allows that we wouldn't? You could divorce your wife if you wanted to. Stoning was a common punishment. So literally getting beaten to death with rocks. Most people had slaves, including the patriarchs, by the way. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Does that mean they were terrible slave owners? Well, of course not. They were good slave owners, but they had slaves. Revenge was a virtue. So if someone comes up and pushes you to the ground, well, the virtuous thing to do is to get back up and kick that person or get your revenge. Revenge is good. Well, that's how it used to be. That was the old law. Revenge was good. Revenge was justice. And probably the worst of all for us nowadays is that in war, it was common, especially if you besiege a town, and the town did not surrender during the siege. You have the right, and it is expected of you as the victorious army to kill everything in sight. This sounds utterly brutal to us, and it is utterly brutal. But my point is, it was how people lived back then. It was simply the way things were back then. Mr. Tran, did you have something? I thought I saw your hand go up. No problem. I'm going to give you guys a really good example. And I think this example will illustrate what Yahweh did with the Israelites. All right, so there's this book called Kabluna by Gontran de Poncin. And I don't know if you've heard of him. He wasn't some kind of famous author or anything. But what this guy did is he decided that he was going to go on an adventure. He was a writer. He was a journalist. And you know how some people say, well, never even run a mile in my life, but I'm going to train for the marathon because I just want to do it. And others say, well, I'm going to climb Mount Everest because I want to prove myself to myself and to the world. Right? Same kind of thing. He, living in this comfortable, 1941 French atmosphere, a man of wealth and means and influence, decided that he was going to try to survive among the Eskimo. He was going to travel all the way to Alaska from France and try to survive in the brutal cold with little food and going out and hunting and all that kind of stuff. Okay. This is what he set out to do. Well, the funny thing is, was there a question?
No.
Okay, the funny thing about this, and I wouldn't last a day. Can you imagine going from here to Alaska in the brutal cold? And we're not talking about living in a place where there's central heat and internet and all. We're talking about brutal times, folks, where the Eskimo back in the 40s, they didn't have any of the modern tech. Today they do. But back then they had zero. And so this was a pretty big step. When he got there, all the Eskimos made fun of him. He was the laughing stock of the Eskimos. He was the fat, out of shape white guy. And here are all these tough Eskimos who are used to, hunting polar bears with their bare hands, surviving on whale fat for weeks. Okay. And so they did not like him, and he was the butt of their jokes. But see, this was part of the challenge he set for himself. Eventually, after a few months, he toughened up and was accepted, although it took a lot of discipline on his part. All right, but what does it have to do with the story? The author observed some crazy stuff, and he was absolutely shocked by some of the crazy stuff, right? When he made the challenge for himself, it was just a physical challenge. Can I do it? I want to be tough, whatever. But he had no idea that he would encounter some really brutal customs among the Eskimo. So I'm going to just talk about a few. All right, so what is wife swapping? Wife swapping is literally what it sounds like. Oh, hey, Johnny. Yeah, what's up, Michael? Well, Johnny, you know what? I like your wife, and I think she likes mine. Let's swap for a little while. Oh, okay, all right, yeah, let's swap. How long? How about a year? Okay. I know this sounds ridiculous, but it's what they did. They wife swapped. Yes, they probably do. 20-hour feast. Now, these aren't just any kind of feasts, because there are still parts of the world where wedding parties will last even longer than that. But these were full-on orgies, right? And he was so scandalized when he saw this stuff. He's like, what have I done? Why am I here? Who are these people, right? Or another thing that surprised him. So let's say, all right, who does this belong to? Does anyone know? This car. All right. So I see it. Oh, okay. Car. I want it. I'm actually going to take it home. Don't tell anyone. Well, then Kara comes back, right? And she says, where's my purple binder? And Leon says, I think Mr. Priman stole it. She would have the right in 20th century Eskimo culture to seek me out and slay me.
What?
Yes! Killing was allowed as a response to theft. It's just the way you did it. And there was no court of law. You don't call the police to arrest, right? If you know someone stole from you, kill the person. It's just the way it is. Now, do you think there was much stealing in their culture?
No.
No, because it's a pretty dang good deterrent. All right. Now, probably the thing he was shocked most about, though, was they would sometimes kill their girl kids. And I have to explain why. It's not like they lived in some kind of crazy macho society. Oh, yeah, let's kill the girls. Or it's not like they had some kind of silly one-child policy. Oh, I can only have one. This is a girl. I want a boy. No, it wasn't that. That would have been frivolous. The only reason they did this was pure survival, folks. And here's why. In their society, and actually this is kind of common even today, it's not a 50-50% chance, 50% chance that you're going to have a boy or a girl. It's a little bit more skewed towards girls as far as probabilities. All right. Now, that also applied to them, which means they sometimes had one or two too many girl babies to match the number of boy babies. And so what they do? Well, they didn't just, let's slay her. No, they solemnly made the sacrifice. The parents very sadly agreed to do it for the good of the survival of the Inuit, what Eskimos call themselves, because they needed it to be 50-50. They needed every man to have one mate. And yes, they would swap, but it still had to be a 1-to-1 ratio. Okay. And so he witnessed sometimes if they had extra girl babies, they would be sacrificed, not brutally killed, not even abortion. That's not even a fair way to look at it. It was a sacrifice done for the good of the community. Now, I'm not justifying it by any means. Don't get me wrong. It's a terrible thing to do. I'm just trying to explain why they did it. Okay, that's all I'm trying to say. If there had been more boys than girls in their culture, because maybe it was 51% boys, 49% girls, they probably would have done the same thing. And then it would be sacrifice of the boy babies. They had to keep the 50-50 ratio. Sounds brutal, I know, but they were living in some pretty extreme conditions. All right, now, the fascinating thing about the story is that there was a missionary priest among the people. I don't know if he was Jesuit or Franciscan, doesn't matter. But there was a priest who had given up all of his comforts to go and dedicate his life and the sacraments to these people and to try to convert them one by one. He did notice that there were Christians, and so the author was pretty scandalized by that too. Father, I know that they call themselves Christians and you give them sacraments, but do you know what's going on? And if you do, why aren't you putting a stop to it? It's a common sense question. We can understand where he's coming from. And I love the priest's response. The priest said, you gotta face facts. You gotta face facts. See, this priest knew that he wasn't going to change their culture every night. Oh, you've been wife swapping for millennia. Well, don't do that anymore because you're a Christian. You know, they're just going to behead the priest. They don't need him there. That's the kind of brutal environment he was living in. And so what did the priest do? He realized, all right, if I can at least get them closer to Christ, even though they're not achieving the fullness of Christianity, that's still better than them being complete pagans and heathens. And he was right about that. Okay. His job was to help the Eskimos adopt Christianity little by little, like helping a chain smoker to cut back gradually. So this priest was probably thinking, all right, I'm going to get some converts. They'll be baptized and stuff. Yeah, these things are still going on. But then my replacement will have a little more success. And as the world progresses and things get modernized, then these practices will eventually be abolished. And sure enough, today they don't exist anymore. Yes, you will not go to Alaska among the Inuit peoples and observe any of these crazy things. It just doesn't happen anymore. You'll also see that they have diesel generators and Wi-Fi and stuff like that. Okay. But my point is that when someone is addicted to something, you can't just break them out of it overnight. There are a few people who, from one day to the next, cold turkey, and they just stop smoking. Some people have enough discipline to do that, but the great majority don't. And so Yahweh knew this, just like this missionary priest knew this. Also, this priest recognized that killing deterred theft and that female infanticide was the last resort survival strategy. So there was not much theft. You wouldn't dare to steal the purple binder. Let me put it back just in case. You wouldn't dare to steal the purple binder because the consequences could be terrible. And as I said before, infanticide happened as seldom as it could. All right, before we go on to the next kind of major area, questions about gradual revelation. Do you see what Yahweh, I guess you could say, had two choices. Just give the fullness of the truth to these crazy Israelites surrounded by brutal neighbors. But he knew better than that. So what we had to have was the old covenant, gradual revelation, changing of habits. And then finally that set the stage for Jesus, who gave us the fullness of truth. All right, next major area, harsh punishments. The Yahweh of the Old Testament is harsh. Or he gets that bad rap. So we're going to address the bad rap. How could he be so cruel? Why did he prescribe stoning for the woman caught in adultery? Or why was that prescribed in the old Mosaic law? Okay, why were some of these harsh punishments prescribed? Well, again, we have to understand what's going on. So what exactly are these? You've got stoning, which is a brutal punishment, but stoning could happen for things that we would nowadays not consider capital offenses. This is why it seems harsh. So doing work on the Sabbath, we would not consider a capital offense, but they did, and you could be stoned. Okay, even disobeying your parents in a grave way, which most of today's teenagers probably do anyway. But back then, this was pretty serious stuff. It's pretty serious stuff. And you could be killed for that, stoned for it if you were caught. So how do we understand it? We understand it in the same way that we understood the original question. Brutal people living in brutal times, surrounded by brutal neighbors. And because the neighbors were brutal, they simply did harsh punishments. It's what you did. You got caught stealing, hand cut off. You were stealing with your left hand. All right, left hand cut off. It's just the way things operated back then. Now we don't get it. See, if James is speaking out of turn, and I come up and I slap him on the face, boy, I am going to get so fired and sued. All right. See, we can't do that stuff anymore. We wouldn't even think about it because we've advanced, right? But back then, boy, can you imagine being a student back then? Coming in without your homework done? Ooh, right? Corporal punishment was used a lot in the classroom, folks. Gosh, even 50, 60, 70 years ago, it was still used quite a bit in the classrooms. My dad tells me stories of when he was in school with nuns and he did something out of turn. He would get the yardstick, bam, on the knuckles. She could really swing that thing. I won't say sister's name. But the point is that it's what people did. They were harsh. They were harsh times, okay? What we do have to keep in mind, though, is that this stuff is tame in comparison to what the other guys did. Okay? The other guys were really over the top. So let's say that James was speaking out of turn. All right, well, since I'm the teacher and I have absolute authority, in those days, that's how it worked, take him outside and have the slave, maybe my slave, maybe a slave, but the slave, to give him 100 lashes. Could he possibly die of the 100 lashes? Yeah, but he was speaking out of turn. See, we don't even understand this anymore. That's why I'm spending time on this. We can't imagine it. People live like that? Heck yeah, they live like that. And so how are we going to understand the Old Testament unless we understand the people? And the Old Testament shows us that Moses, that covenant, those punishments were a progression. They were much less harsh by comparison. Harsh punishments taught the Israelites a life and death lesson. Yahweh's laws were sacred and the covenant mattered more than anything else. I'm going to highlight this, underline it. Covenant mattered more than anything else. See, folks, the covenant was everything. We have separation of church and state and freedom of religion, and we expect our religious worship to be protected. Yeah, that's good. But back then, there was no separation of church and state. The covenant was the state. The covenant was the church. The covenant was everything. Everything. There was nothing besides the covenant. That's life. And so, why the punishments? Because not only did religion depend on observance of the law, but society's order itself depended on the contract, on the covenant. All right. So these punishments then were meant to drive that lesson home and keep things orderly, both religiously and civilly. It was the only way. You guys know that, I know this was true 20 years ago, might not still be. A friend of mine 20 years ago went to Singapore. And when he was in an elevator, saw a sign, that was, it was written in English. It had subtitles in English, and it said, spitting in elevator, $500 fine, right? And then he saw signs on the streets that had even higher fines for spitting on the streets. And guess what, folks? Was there spit to be found anywhere? No. Now, I'm not saying we need to impose that in our country, but I'm saying that harsh punishments have a deterrent effect, which means they're probably not even going to get carried out at all because no one will even do the stuff. So when we see harsh punishments, we think, oh gosh, they were beating everybody. No, it's just people were better because they wanted to avoid the beatings. All right, so here's a really controversial passage. I'm going to read from my Bible, and you'll recognize it when you hear it. All right, so 2 Samuel 6, 1-7. David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. David and all the people with him set out and went from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. They carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went in front of the cart. David and all the house of Israel were dancing before the Lord with all their might, songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah reached out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen shook it. The anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him there because he reached out his hand to the ark. In other words, God struck him down. Now, why is this confusing? Because we think, wasn't he just trying to help? Why did he get struck down for trying to help? But see, it's deeper than that. And the main thing it's deeper than is that it was disrespectful to carry the ark on an ox cart. It would be, all right, let's compare to something you guys can understand. It'd be like if I'm a Eucharistic minister and I'm going to bring communion to someone who's sick, it'd be like me putting those hosts in a used napkin. Disgusting, right? But see, that's how the Israelites saw the ark. The ark to them was as sacred as the Eucharist is for us. And so the real reason for the punishment wasn't even trying to steady it. The reason for the punishment was that it shouldn't have been on the ox cart in the first place. Okay. Now, why the harsh punishment? Because again, folks, it's a life and death covenant. A life and death covenant means that if it's not followed, then society simply crumbles. Mr. Trent.
What happened was there another? Sorry, when I listened, there was another person on the cart. What happened to that other person?
Well, that other person did not get struck down. Well, you could say that was mercy. The question could be, well, then they all should have been struck down. Okay, well, maybe that would have been perfect justice. But see, remember how mercy transcends and includes justice? Mercy always enters. And so mercy could have been just one was punished severely rather than all. We don't understand the mind of God completely, but that's one possible explanation. Was there, Miss Griffin?
But isn't that punishment a bit confusing? Because if you were an Israelite, wouldn't you think he was punished just for touching it? So they probably wouldn't mind putting it back on an ox cart, but they just wouldn't touch it.
No. And the reason I say that is because it wasn't just Uzzah, but everyone actually knew that this was not the right thing to do. And you might say, well, they were pretty brazen to be dancing with instruments and everything while they're carrying the Eucharist in a used napkin. But see, everyone knew that was wrong. The law was very clear on the proper way to transport an ark. And the proper way was only with handles and only with humans specifically chosen to do it, right? Nothing of ox carts. To answer your question, all the people knew better than this. And so they all would have gotten the right message. You see what I'm saying? If we were doing a Eucharistic procession now, and the monstrance, instead of being the nice gold jewel bedecked thing, it's just this lame piece of plastic, right? Not even washed. All the Catholics in the procession would realize, something's off with that. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. All right. More on harsh punishments. So the lesson, the bottom line lesson is, an ox cart was not a valid transport, and no man was allowed to touch the ark. Here, many of them had dared to touch the ark, right? Ones who weren't chosen for that purpose, and to touch it in a place that wasn't the handles designed for that purpose, and to put it on an invalid transport. Now, again, this sounds really harsh and brutal to us, but we've got to remember the people, the culture, and the times. It's those circumstances that help us to understand stuff. And I'll repeat it. The covenant was everything. It wasn't just the most important thing. It was the only thing. Now, I don't even say that to you guys. I don't say your Catholic religion is the only thing in your lives. It's just, no, it should definitely be the most important thing. See, I wouldn't say, oh, it's the only thing. But see, back then, folks, it was the only thing. Every single thing they did, work, play, leisure, all of it fit into the covenant somehow. And everything they did was regulated by rules. Mind-blowing to us because we're not used to it. Now, here's another very controversial passage. So I'll read it again, and let's see how it strikes you. And by the way, these are the exact verses that non-Christian opponents are going to ask you someday when they object to your Old Testament. Okay, so in Leviticus 21:9, a lot of these are laws about the priesthood and how priests need to behave and how they need to carry out the sacrifices and stuff like that. Okay, so no one shall defile himself for a dead person among his relatives, except for his nearest kin, mother, father, son, daughter, brother, likewise for a virgin sister close to him, because she has had no husband, right? So those are just regulations. They shall not shave off the edges of their beards or make any gashes of their flesh, right? So norms for priests' behavior. They shall be holy to their God and not profane the name of their God, for they offer the Lord's offerings by fire, the food of their God. Therefore, priests shall be holy. They shall not marry a prostitute or a woman who has been defiled. Neither shall they marry a woman divorced from her husband, for they are holy to their God. That could have been permitted for non-priests. It was not permitted for priests. When the daughter of a priest profanes herself through prostitution, she profanes her father, she shall be burned to death. Now, if we only take Leviticus 21:9 out of context, as your opponents will, all it looks like to them is daughter burning, can't burn your daughters. But see, they are missing the point. And the point is that the priesthood is sacred because the covenant is everything, and the daughter is a reflection of the priest. And that is then a burnt offering to God of something that should have never happened in the first place. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying that this is the people that we're dealing with. Okay? Again, that doesn't even try to justify it. It just helps us to understand why it was commanded. 2 Samuel 24:14-15. All right, so this is where David sins with Bathsheba and is going to be punished. But because Yahweh is merciful, he allows David to choose the punishment. Okay, so let me just pull up.
What did he choose?
I'm going to read it to you. Okay, so this is when Nathan catches him, and then David, realizes his shame and confesses. When David rose in the morning, the word of the Lord, so this is after he's been caught. When David rose in the morning, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Gad, David's seer, saying, "Go and say to David, thus says the Lord, 3 things I offer you. Choose one of them, and I will do it to you." So Gad came to David and told him, he asked, "Shall 3 years of famine come to you on your land? Or will you flee 3 months before your foes while they pursue you? Or shall there be 3 days pestilence in your land? Now consider and decide what answer I shall return to the one who sent me. David said to Gad, I am in great distress. Let us fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but let me not fall into human hands. In other words, David is rejecting the first two options, and so he chose the 3 days of pestilence. David was allowed to choose the least severe of the three. Now, was it still severe? Yes. But he was given the choice, which is mercy. Did Yahweh need to give him a choice? No, but he did because Yahweh is merciful. However, does mercy deny justice? No, mercy includes justice. And we see that here, okay? Now, why was it the most merciful? Well, first of all, it's only 3 days, it's not 3 years. Second, you're not falling in the hands of enemies who could have just killed everybody. And third, there is a chance that some people are going to recover, which did in fact happen. Some people got sick and recovered. All right, let's talk more about how justice and mercy go together, so that even in the Old Testament, we're going to see some mercy. Okay, so in Exodus 21, 22 to 30, we're talking about the proper treatment of people. Miss McCarty?
Why did the punishment for David punish these people?
It's a very good question, and here's the reason. David represented the people as their head. So let's look at a couple of similar situations. We've got one in Leviticus where we see the daughters punished for, or punished more severely because her father's a priest, because she represents the priesthood. David represents the nation, and the people are considered under him. An even better example is we are sons and daughters of Adam. Adam was our head. We all suffered through him. Our new head, however, is Jesus Christ, through baptism, through which we become adopted sons of the Father. But what I'm trying to tell you is that since David represented the people, all the people suffered. This would not have happened if a non-king had been the guilty one. Okay. Now, again, that sounds unfair to us, but this is a different time. We don't have kings. They did. Okay, so in Exodus 21, 22, when people who are fighting injure a pregnant woman so that there is a miscarriage, and yet no further harm follows, the one responsible shall be fined what the woman's husband demands, paying as much as the judges determine. All right, sounds harsh, but if this had been another culture, slaying on the spot. See, it's a step up. That's my point. If any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. Revenge is a virtue in the old days. When a slave owner strikes the eye of a male or female slave, destroying it, the owner shall let the slave go, a free person, to compensate for the eye. If the owner knocks out a tooth of a male or female slave, the slave shall be let go, a free person, to compensate for the tooth. Do you guys see how, as harsh and brutal as the law of Moses sounds, it's still way better than anything else at the time? Because I guarantee you, all the other cultures offered no protections whatsoever to slaves. Oh, you knocked a tooth out of your slave? Why don't you knock all the teeth out? There was zero protection of slaves. They were nothing but animals and property. But see, in the law of Moses, harsh as it seems to us, Moses or slaves are people who have rights and deserve to be compensated if they are injured. Okay, so we should all see that this was a step up from where the Israelites were, and it was a preparation for the fullness of truth. Now, we saved the big daddy of them all for last. Genocide. And the reason this is the big daddy of them all is because this is probably the biggest accusation that non-Christians will have against the Yahweh of the Old Testament. Your God practices genocide. Your God ordered all men, women, and children and animals to be killed. Your God is cruel. Blah, blah, blah. And people will tell you that to your face. They will. So this is one of their biggest clubs they're going to try to hit you over the head with to try to convince you that Yahweh is bad and Christianity is foolish. Yahweh commands the indiscriminate massacre and ethnic cleansing of the Canaanites. How can this be? Yes, he does command that. But we need to understand why. That's going to be so important. We need to understand why. And here's the first reason why. This is actually the first of many reasons, because this is going to be a pretty long argument. But the first thing to just throw out there is the Canaanites were bad people. The Canaanites would have made Nazi Germany look like a walk in the park. I am not kidding you, folks. These were evil, bestial people. Unimaginably so. And the things that I wrote here are the tamest of the tame. I couldn't even say some of the stuff they did. I won't even think about it because it's that disturbing. Bestiality like you can't imagine. It's awful. They were awful. And see, we can't even imagine what they were like. We can't, because not a single culture in today's world is like that. That's why we just can't even imagine it. What do you mean, Mr. Fryman? A really evil people? Yes, they were a very evil people who were documented by many historians as having done very evil things. A culture that was based on evil practices, of which the tamest I've listed. All right, we're out of time, unfortunately, but we will continue this later. You guys are a great class. Have a good day.
Thank you, Mr. Brown.
You're welcome.